Thank you for inviting me here to share with you. Um, I guess I can go ahead because I'm going to keep this a little bit informal since we're meeting here in a living room and space is kind of at a premium. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first, or I might do it a little bit later on in the introduction. But my name is Clinton Wilcox, and I'm a full-time pro-life advocate from Sanger, California, but I tell people Fresno because that's more well known than Sanger is, and plus, and it sounds and well, yeah, it's about 15 miles give or take from Fresno, and plus there's no airport in Sanger, so I have to fly out from Fresno, so it's basically close enough.
So I can't say I'm from Fresno.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
That's a little bit of a commute.
Stretch?
So yeah, a little bit of a stretch, right? Yeah. And so I'm a full-time pro-life advocate. I work for an organization called Life Training Institute. If you're not familiar with that, that is Scott Klusendorf's organization. He's the president of LTI. And so a lot of what I do for LTI is I do a lot of online work. I write articles for the blog. I do a podcast. I answer questions that are submitted to the website, things like that. And I also go around doing speaking engagements like this. So I'm also a published author. I have 2 articles published in Christian Research Journal with one more that's forthcoming. And I just recently had an article published in Bioethics, which is one of the top 5 leading bioethics journals in the world. And so it's up for early review until they actually assign it to a publication. So needless to say, I've read a bit about the issue of abortion. I've actually been involved in the movement for about 7 years now, going on 8. So have any or most of you had a lot of conversations on controversial topics like abortion or even just sharing your faith, especially through social media, that kind of thing? Yeah. How about abortion specifically? Do you ever talk about this issue? Yeah. Okay. So what I have to talk about here is what I do in the pro-life movement is my niche in the movement is education, and I specialize in training people how to make the pro-life case effectively and persuasively. And so the topic that I'm talking about here tonight is the topic of why I believe pro-life people need to become amateur philosophers. And so don't let that scare you if you haven't read a lot of philosophy. There's actually not much to it, and it's a lot less reading than you might expect. But there are a lot of good things out there to read on the topic. So the reason that it's significant, though, is it's not just that it's a very, very interesting. Like, I'm very interested by philosophy and a lot of philosophical issues, but the reason that it's significant is because a lot of people are not very good at thinking critically. And so, especially when you talk about the issue of abortion, you're going to encounter a lot of people who think they have a good argument for abortion, but it really turns out that they're actually kind of confusing certain key terms and assuming one thing means the same thing as another when it actually means something completely different. And so knowing these things, kind of keeping these things in mind, will actually help you be a better communicator of your own position, but it will also help you to be able to pinpoint where a pro-choice person has gone wrong and graciously and persuasively convince them that they've gone wrong somewhere and be able to show them how to correct their error, essentially. So the three things that I'd like to talk about, and the first part is definitely going to be the lengthiest. I'm going to basically cover this in 3 parts. That the first part is going to be that philosophers think carefully about issues. That's one reason why pro-life people need to become amateur philosophers. That philosophers think carefully about issues. The second one is going to be that philosophers ask questions, and the third one is going to be that philosophers attack ideas, not people. So this first part is definitely going to be the most helpful when we talk about the arguments that pro-choice people make. And I should probably iterate also, because I seem to have forgotten. That happens a lot. If anybody's listening on the broadcast, the Facebook Live, I'm going to open it up to Q&A later. So save your questions and ask them, and I'll have Devin monitoring the feed, and he'll ask any questions that are asked by the Facebook Live participants. Okay, so this first part is that philosophers think carefully about issues. And another way that I could frame this is that philosophers make distinctions. And that's very important as far as thinking critically and as far as being able to reason correctly on a lot of issues, especially on the abortion issue. Now, I brought 8 ways in which we need to make distinctions, but this could really be multiplied pretty much indefinitely. I could come up with a much longer list, but I'm trying to make sure we're not here till 2 or 3 in the morning. So the first way in which we need to be able to make distinctions is regarding the distinction between philosophy and science. Now, I opted to give this presentation today. I'm not really going to give a full defense of the pro-life position like I did on Tuesday at the Ratio Christi chapter there in Rock Hill. But suffice it to say that pro-life people argue that human life begins at fertilization biologically. The science is settled on that question. Embryologists consistently agree that human life begins at fertilization. So biologically, human life begins at fertilization. And then philosophically, we would also say that human beings are persons from fertilization. We would say that all human beings are persons, even though not all persons are human beings. And so this is how we need to be able to keep this question separate, because not only because we'll kind of muddy the waters or obfuscate issues if we try and tell people that science has told us when life begins, when we start talking about personhood, because the question of personhood is a philosophical question, not a scientific one. The question of when biological life begins is a scientific one, not a philosophical one. So we need to be able to keep these distinctions separate, and a pro-choice person you encounter who is aware of these distinctions will call you on it if you're not careful. But also, there are a lot of pro-choice people who also make these kinds of errors. Recently, I posted a book review of a book by a pro-choice abortionist named Willie Parker, who wrote a book kind of chronicling his journey to become an abortion doctor, and also why he believes doing abortions is actually fulfilling the Great Commission. Go figure that one out. I still haven't been able to do that. But I posted a review on it, and part of my review was that Willie Parker, who is a doctor and who should know better, doesn't actually make a case against the pro-life position that human life begins at fertilization. He just kind of assumes it. And so part of my critique of his book is that the science is clear that human life does begin at fertilization. And so someone who came on to comment wanted to critique my review of his book and tried to tell me that scientists actually haven't settled the question of when life begins. And so he started posting quotes by biologists and developmental biologists trying to show that they believe life begins when, for example, when the brain starts functioning or when you become self-aware, these kinds of things. And so to many people that might seem convincing unless you've actually been reading and studying the issue, because what's going on here is these biologists are actually making the same mistake that I've outlined here. They're confusing the concept of personhood with the concept of biological life. Because it is the case that human life begins biologically at fertilization, and there's scientific consensus. That's just without question. Ever since the mid to late 1800s, we've known that biologically human life begins at fertilization. So these scientists are conflating the concept of biological life with the concept of personhood. There are philosophers who would argue that personhood begins once you become self-aware, and their rationale would be something like because you have to be able to desire your own life, because you have to desire something in order to be harmed by being deprived of it. So by saying that scientists say that life begins at some other time than fertilization is just not the case. So this is one area in which we have to really understand the distinction between science and philosophy, because otherwise a pro-choice person who's really trying to obfuscate the issue might catch us off guard. So that's a very important way. Number 2 is another very common mistake, is that people confuse moral prescriptions with preference claims. So how many of you are convinced by my statement that you are immoral if you do not agree that mint chocolate chip is the best kind of ice cream that there is? Yeah, you agree? Okay, I've got 2 people looks like who agree. Yeah. Okay. How about if I were to say that you are morally obligated to write in pencil when you do your homework, as opposed to writing in pen? Yes? No? No? So what's my mistake here in my claims? What am I doing here by trying to argue that there's something morally wrong with you if you don't like the same kind of ice cream I do, or don't write with a pencil as opposed to a pen? Yeah, so those are subjective desires. They're what we would call preference claims. It's my preference that mint chocolate chip is the best kind of ice cream, but it'd be awfully silly for me to claim that you're immoral if you disagree, right? Yeah, same with my preferred type of writing utensil. If I prefer to write with a pencil, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something immoral by writing with a pen instead of with a pencil. Now, I could probably make the case that it's a good idea to write with a pencil as opposed to a pen, but I don't think I could really make a moral case for that kind of thing. So my two statements are kind of extreme ways of showing that if we're not careful, we can actually confuse a moral claim with a preference claim. Because my claim that mint chocolate chip is the best kind of ice cream is not the same kind of claim as saying it is immoral to torture babies for fun. Right? Those are two different kinds of claims. The first one is a subjective claim about my preference. The second one is an objective moral claim that I'm arguing that it's wrong for everybody to torture babies for fun or to do whatever moral claim I want to throw in there. So the way that they tend to make this confusion in the abortion issue, and this is probably something, especially if you've been talking about it as long as I have, you've probably heard someone say that you have no right to force your views off on me. Abortion might be wrong for you, but I think it's okay, so it's okay for me. You have no right to tell me what to do. Yeah, that's a fairly common one. And so the confusion that they're making there is that we're not trying to say that abortion is distasteful to us, like eating some bad fish. We're not trying to say that having an abortion is just left up to the individual. That's a preference claim. What we're saying is that there's an actual moral prescription against having an abortion. That having an abortion is immoral for everyone under any circumstance. And so this is a way in which they tend to obfuscate the issue. Also, is that they confuse moral claims, moral prescriptions with preference claims. Okay, now the third one is one that you're probably not going to be aware of unless you've actually read some of the philosophers, because this one is a bit more philosophical in nature, but it's actually one of the most egregious ways a pro-choice person can make this mistake. And so the third one here is confusing active potency with passive potency. Do we have any Aristotelians here in the? Yeah. Okay. Right here. Okay. Good. So at least these two guys here know what I'm talking about. But I'll fill the rest of you in. It's not a trade secret, so don't worry. Okay. So So there's a really popular meme that's been going around Facebook, and it bugs me every time I see it, because even if you're not familiar with the concepts of active and passive potency, it really seems like this ought to be something that just kind of at a visceral level you ought to understand is just kind of goofy thinking. So there's a meme that goes around. You don't know what memes are, right? Yeah, right. Yeah, sorry, you're all probably much younger than I am, so yeah, you probably.
All we know these days.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah. So there's this meme that goes around, and it has 4 panels on it, and in one panel you read something like a silkworm is not a dress, an egg is not a chicken. What's the third one? A house is not a blueprint, for example, and then it has a picture of a human fetus. This is not a person, and then it says like condescendingly below, this is not a difficult concept. And of course, every time I have to think, well, yeah, it apparently is a difficult concept because you don't get it. Yeah. So and this is not just something that non-academics do. Academic scientists and philosophers make this same mistake. There's a scientist which you may or may not be familiar with. He's not really a household name, but his name is P.Z. Myers, and he's not a very good thinker, but he is a biologist. And he even made this same mistake when he was trying to critique a pro-life argument. He's in one of his articles, he says that an iron ingot is not a car, which of course is true, but he's confusing, again, the concept of active with passive potency. So what do I mean by active and passive potency? Well, potency is the capacity that something has to become something else. That's basically what it is. So, for example, or not necessarily just to become something else, but it also has certain abilities that it can perform. Like if I had a red rubber ball just lying there on the table, it has the potential to bounce because it's made of rubber, and rubber is a bouncy material. So it has the potential to bounce. That potential is not going to be fulfilled unless someone knocks it off the table or picks it up and actually bounces it on the top of the table. So that's a potency that it has, and so the potency is needs to be actualized before it can before it can perform whatever it has the potency to do. And anything that has a potency must always be acted on by the outside in order to fulfill that potency. But now, so the difference then between an active and a passive potency is where the locus of the action must come from. So let's consider, for example, and believe me, this will come full circle, and I'll come back around to show how it responds to these views. So let's consider. Oh man, I have a piece of hair that's kind of bothering me. Okay, so let's think of fire, right? So we have a match, and then we have a log of wood. Okay, so both the match and the wood have the potential to catch on fire. The match has that potency actively because it has it within itself to catch fire. The log of wood has that potency passively because it doesn't have within itself the ability to catch fire, but it does have the ability to catch fire if acted upon from the outside. So I could strike the match, which would cause that match to catch fire, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken here. Okay, cool. So you can strike the match to catch it on fire, and then you can put the match over to the log of wood, and the log of wood will catch fire. So these two things have the potency to catch fire, but they have the potency in different ways. The match has the potency actively because it has it within itself, and the wood has that potency passively because it needs to be acted upon from the outside in order to fulfill that potency. So now you might be thinking, well, what does all this have to do with abortion? Well, I'm glad you asked. These memes that say, for example, a silkworm is not a dress, and a blueprint is not a house, an iron ingot is not a car. All of these things have the potency to become whatever it is. So we have, for example, an iron ingot, which is just part of like a big hunk of metal. That iron ingot has the potential to become a car, but it must be acted upon from outside. It's not going to become a car on its own. And just like with the silkworm, the silk that the silkworm produces, the silk is not going to become a dress on its own. It needs to be formed into a dress. So it needs to be acted upon by the outside to become a dress because it has the potency to become a dress, but not unless acted upon from the outside. And then also, the blueprint does not even have a potency to become a house because the blueprint is what you look upon to construct a house. And so if we're looking at a blueprint with a house, the relationship is more like the DNA. Because the DNA is what causes the person to develop, but it's not the actual person itself. So the blueprint house analogy is just all kinds of silly. So basically, all of these things to say that if we look at this silk becoming a dress, if we look at the iron ingot becoming a car, all of these things have the potency passively because they have to be acted upon by the outside in order to form what they're going to form. And these kinds of potencies do not preserve the identity of the thing. The dress that the silk goes in to make, the silk is still there, but it becomes a brand new thing than it was before. Now, contrast that with a human being. A human being is a human right from the very beginning. Once the sperm and the ovum mix together and fuse, both the sperm and the ovum cease to exist, and a new genetically human being is formed. And so that human being, right from the very beginning, from the single cell stage, has the potency actively within himself to develop himself into a more mature version of himself. So in this case, the unborn organism, the zygote, has the active potential to become a more mature version of himself, to become a fetus, to become an infant, a newborn, an adolescent, a teenager, etc., etc. It has all of this within himself to become, which is different from the silk and from the iron ingot and from all of these other things, like the egg, becoming a chicken, those kinds of things. So all of these things, when you have the silk and when you have the iron ingot, you don't have what these things are going to become because they need to be constructed and they need to be built. But the human being, right from the very beginning, is a human being and will develop himself along the path of human development. And so that's why we have to be aware of these kinds of distinctions, because when the pro-choice person tries to argue that a human embryo is not a person because a silkworm is not a dress, or because an egg is not a chicken, all of these things, well, we need to be able to pinpoint and say, that's because these things need to be acted upon by the outside, whereas the human embryo has it within himself to develop along the path of human development. Are we all tracking with this here? Do we have any? Any confusions? Yeah, go ahead and speak up now.
So isn't the egg kind of like the same thing as like an embryo in a way? Like it needs to, I mean, it will become a chicken if left, at least warmed, I guess, in the embryo.
Yeah, so the egg is slightly differently because the egg actually contains a chicken embryo. So arguing that an egg is not a chicken, like some pro-choice people do, is kind of even more sillier because the egg actually contains the chicken embryo, and the chicken embryo will develop and will eventually hatch once it becomes ready to hatch. So it actually has the chicken embryo inside, which will develop itself. So the chicken embryo is like the human embryo because it has the active potency within itself to develop along the path of chickenness. So yeah. Yeah.
I just have, so I guess it might be my grasp of the philosophy behind it. But so is feeding the embryo an active potency, or
You mean like taking in nutrients through
in order
the
to grow and things like that?
Right,
Like if you don't feed the embryo,
then it'll die because
right.
it
I'm
needs
just
food
playing
to survive.
devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah, so I mean, feeding the embryo isn't necessarily an act of active potency because the embryo itself has the capacity to take in food and it has the capacity within itself to metabolize that food for energy.
Sure.
And so the act of feeding itself isn't necessarily an act of potency. The embryo itself has the potency to be able to metabolize that food. So it's more an act of giving the embryo the nutrients it needs, and then the embryo's body will take those nutrients and metabolize it for energy. Is that okay? Yeah. Are we good? So are we clear on that? Because I don't teach this concept very often, so I want to make sure I'm making everything clear for everyone before I move on. Are we good?
So passive
Okay.
potency is
Yeah.
external forces acting upon the object,
Pretty much, yeah.
and then active potency, internal force.
It has the ability within itself. Yeah. Now, of course, this is Aristotle, so these concepts actually get a lot more complicated, and we I could probably talk for hours just on the concept itself. But this is just kind of a bare bones explanation of these concepts, and this is really all you need to know as far as how to respond to these pro-choice considerations. So in a nutshell, the passive potency is where something needs to act upon it from outside, such as the wood needing to be acted upon by something that has fire in order to give it fire. And then the active potency is where it has the potential within itself. So the match has an active potency because you can strike it and it'll produce the fire on its own. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that's the active versus passive potency. That's probably one of the most egregious errors and one of the most common errors I see from pro-choice people as well. And so knowing these concepts will go a long way toward being able to help you, explain how the pro-choice person has kind of gone wrong and be able to explain how to get their comments back on track here. Okay, so the next one that we have is the difference between intrinsic value versus instrumental value. Now, so intrinsic versus instrumental value, it just depends on where the value comes from. So intrinsic value means that the value comes from within yourself. So for example, we, especially as Christians, we would say that human beings are intrinsically valuable because the value of a human being, it comes from within themselves. There's nothing that I need to do to make myself valuable. People are just supposed to value me because I'm a human being, or if you want to go even the more fundamental religious route, I'm made in God's image. And so I'm intrinsically valuable because I have the image of God. Instrumental value is a kind of extrinsic value. For something that's instrumentally valued, the value comes from outside it. And so money would be an example of something that's instrumentally valuable. Those pieces of paper that you might have in your wallet are completely worthless, except for the fact that our society has deemed that it's good for trade, for goods and for resources and services and things like that. So money has instrumental value because its value is completely dependent upon the society in which you find it in. Other cultures don't use paper money. Some have used seashells and other things for barter. So that's the difference then between intrinsic and instrumental value. And so often, you might hear a pro-choice person make this kind of confusion too. Recently on Twitter, there was a science fiction author named Patrick Tomlinson who talks about how he has this thought experiment that he raises to pro-life people, and no one has ever been able to give him an honest reaction or an honest answer to his thought experiment. And just as an aside, it's probably because whenever someone tried to give him an answer, he blocked them. True story. So I thought that was pretty funny, but yeah, apparently the irony of that was lost on him. But so his thought experiment then is not new, nor is it novel. he basically argues that suppose you're in a burning research lab, and and you have on one side you have a canister of say 1,000 embryos, and on your other side you have a toddler. Now you can only save one. Who are you going to save? And he uses this to illustrate that since just about everybody, including pro-life people, will save the toddler, well, then that shows that we don't really think that the embryos are as valuable as that toddler is, especially since we're letting 1,000 of them die to save that one toddler. So just out of curiosity, how would someone respond to that kind of scenario? And don't worry, I'm not going to be judging anybody's answers, so I'm just kind of curious.
Responding maybe with the same question back.
Okay, how would that go?
I mean, it could go in the reverse. Like you place the value on the embryos more than the child, or the child more than the embryos. Either way, it's still.
Yeah, and the way the pro-choice person would respond is that I do think that the embryos are worthless because they're not people yet, but that toddler is. So I think everyone should save the toddler.
Yeah.
And that's what. Yeah. So they'd probably be okay with that. Yeah.
So I would say that the child is feels pain,
Mhm.
is growing, and is actively maturing, whereas embryos in like a stasis container, they're just like frozen in time. They're it kind of reminds me of the passive potency just a little bit, because they're not in a womb and they're not actively growing at that time.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to go. You can talk about the various ways that they might or might not suffer during the fire. Like one is already out of the womb, already grown, and those kinds of things. So yeah, so you can look at that. You can look at that kind of perspective. Yeah. Does anyone else have some thoughts? Yeah.
Or could you also argue to kind of put it in a way of maybe it's like they have a problem with like the age. Let's say you have like your 4-year-old. If your 4-year-old child is in a burning house, and there's also a random baby in your house. Which one are you going to save? Kind of to see the difference of, do you really care about how well developed they are, or if it's only personal to you?
Right. Yeah, that's another way you could go too. Is you could adjust the thought experiment slightly to ask them what they would do in that situation. So yeah, so these kinds of responses go to show that the person making this thought experiment is kind of confusing the concept of intrinsic value with instrumental value, because we as pro-life people would say that we believe every embryo is intrinsically valuable. So that's why we oppose abortion, because we believe that killing them is wrong. Because for no reason, like not for anything they can do for us, but just because they are human beings who have a rational nature, who are created in God's image. Yeah.
I think what's also extremely irritating about that entire argument is that when most people do get an abortion, they're not saving the life of another child to kill their embryo. I mean.
Yeah.
So
right. Exactly.
they're not in that moral dilemma anyway.
Right. Yeah. And so that's the issue. That in abortion, you're considering who you're going to kill, whereas in this thought experiment, you're considering who you're going to save. And so that's why this confuses the concept of intrinsic with instrumental value. We believe that all embryos have intrinsic value because they are human beings, and so we believe that killing them through the act of abortion is wrong. But when you look at this thought experiment of, you're in a burning research lab, who are you going to save, 1,000 embryos or a toddler? Now we're talking about instrumental value. Because now we're no longer talking about who we're going to kill, we're going to talk about who we're going to save. Because what if, for example, we're talking about a room full of strangers and your own son or daughter? Well, now suddenly the equation changes. You're probably going to rescue your child over the room full of strangers. And so that's because the child, even though all of these strangers are intrinsically valuable, and you believe that they're just as valuable as your child, that child has greater instrumental value to you. And not only that, but there are also other factors, like you've been entrusted to the protection of the child. And so there are other considerations, most of them having to do with instrumental value. And so this is a way in which they can actually confuse the concept of intrinsic with instrumental value as well. Okay, so intrinsic versus instrumental value. Another way that people can make confusions in this issue is that they confuse the concept of a fundamental right with the concept of a legal right. So who can tell me what the difference is between those two kinds of rights? I figure since we've already opened up the floor, I might as well...
Fundamental
See if we
And the
can-
one that we're just given because we're human, it's a God-given right, and legal is given to us by the state.
Right, yeah, exactly. So a fundamental right they're also called basic human rights. We have those rights because of the kind of thing that we are, which is that we're human beings. We don't call them self-awareness rights. We don't call them consciousness rights. We call them human rights because you enjoy those rights just because they're human. And so we also oppose abortion because abortion is oh, there's a word I'm blanking on. Abortion is, it's essentially negating the natural rights of the unborn human being in order to justify killing them for some reason, usually for an area of convenience. So the fundamental right is something that we all have just by our nature, by virtue of what we are. A legal right is a right that is granted by the government, and it's usually attained through maturity. So, for example, the right to vote and the right to hold public office are also are actually legal rights. So, if someone who is, for example, a native of Italy comes over to the United States, that native of Italy does not have the right to vote in one of our elections, but he still has natural rights like the right to life that must still be respected while he's over here. Now, so a lot of people tend to make these confusions. This is one that I see fairly frequently, is that I'll see people who are trying to justify the fact that the unborn have no rights. And they'll usually say something like, it's obvious that the unborn don't have any rights. We don't let them vote. We don't let them drive. So, of course, they don't have rights. But again, this is making those confusions because, they can't vote because we've set an age limit. You have to be 18 in order to vote. And you can't drive because you have to be 16 in order to drive. We've set these age limits. But that doesn't negate the fact that the unborn do have fundamental rights because they're human beings. So they have these fundamental rights by virtue of what they are. And another kind of amusing thing is that often you'll hear people say that the unborn do not have a natural right to life. That in fact I've actually heard some people argue that there is no right to life because if you go out to like the wild and get killed by a lion, well they're not going to respect any sort of right to life. But of course that's kind of a specious argument because rights are basically how we should treat each other. If you walk out into like a lion's den or a bear cave, then you kind of get what's coming to you, that kind of thing. But so they can be confused in that way as well. So you can actually hear people say that the unborn do not have a right to life, but then in the next breath they'll say that the right to abortion is a fundamental human right. So that results in the fairly amusing paradox that the unborn do not have a right to live, but they do have the right to an abortion. So so try and come to grips with that one. So we need to be able to keep these concepts straight. We need to be able to keep the concept of a fundamental, basic human right and a legal right separate. We need to be able to make that distinction as well. Okay, so the next one is that people tend to confuse what a thing is with what a thing is made of. And this is another very common argument that you hear is, for example, the embryo is just a clump of cells. Right? If you try to argue that that human beings are human beings from fertilization from the very beginning, someone is going to say it's just a clump of cells, it doesn't have rights, it's not valuable. And so what they're doing is they're actually committing what we would call a metaphysical fallacy. And it's a metaphysical fallacy because it's making a confusion of the nature of the thing and just basically reducing it down to what it's made of. But of course, human beings are more than just the sum of their parts. It's not, the early embryo up until a few weeks may look like a clump of cells, but it's actually a highly organized individual, an organism that's developing itself into a more mature version of itself. And fairly quickly, it starts to take on more human features. But even before it takes on what we might recognize as human features, it looks exactly like all human beings do that early in their development. So even if it lacks what we would consider common human features, it still looks exactly like human beings should at that stage in their development. So that's another common confusion. Just a couple more here. People tend to confuse qualitative changes with quantitative changes. So what this means is that people tend to confuse the types of changes that an embryo undergoes and thinking that the change is a lot more drastic than it actually is. So a qualitative change has to do with qualities or properties. So it's true that the unborn from fertilization undergo certain changes. It's obvious just by looking at them. It starts very, very, very small, very tiny, smaller than the period on a page of paper, and it eventually grows and it becomes a lot bigger than it started off with. It also develops a lot more as it grows. And it also depends less and less on the woman's body. As it goes on, it becomes more and more viable to live outside in the outside world. So all of these changes are what we would call qualitative changes. They're not changes in the kind of thing that the embryo is. They're changes in the kinds of things that the embryo can do. Now, a quantitative change is a change that would change the nature of the individual into something it was, into something brand new. So, for example, if you have the sperm and the ovum cells, those things are not identical to the embryo that it produces. So when the sperm and the ovum merge, they both cease to exist. They undergo a quantitative change, something that changes the nature of those two human cells into something that is the beginning of a human organism. So all of these changes that the unborn organism from fertilization undergoes are not changes that change the nature of the individual into something that doesn't have rights, or from something that doesn't have rights into something that does. And then finally, another one we need to keep distinct are legality versus morality. And this is important because it should be fairly obvious, but sometimes you'll get people who just aren't really thinking about this kind of thing, that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's moral, and just because something is moral doesn't mean it's legal. So in fact, a very kind of a potent analogy we can give is, 100 years ago, slavery was legal in the United States. Slavery was legal, but that doesn't mean that it was moral. So even though slavery was legal, anyone who owned a slave was still doing something immoral, even though the law permitted them to do so. So in today's age, we don't have slavery legal anymore, but we do have abortion legal. And so just because abortion is legal, that doesn't mean that it's moral. And so often people just argue that, abortion is legal, so you need to get over it. They'll argue that it's the law of the land, and the law of the land, isn't going to change. Which, of course, isn't true, because slavery was once legal again, and it's now illegal. So just calling abortion the law of the land doesn't do anything toward determining whether or not we should work toward making it illegal or outlawing it, or even just making it unthinkable. Okay, so these are just some of the ways in which the confusion can happen when we talk to people about abortion. And again, like I said, I brought in 8. That can probably seem a little overwhelming if you're not really prepared for it, but it's just something that'll come with time. When I come in and give these presentations, I don't expect everyone to just perfectly memorize everything and go off and just be this amazing arguer for the pro-life position. It does take time. Like I said, I've been studying the issue for almost 8 years now. And so this has just all come through the hard work of reading and having these kinds of interactions as well. So my first part then was that philosophers think carefully about issues, or they think critically about these issues because they make distinctions. So my second point then is that philosophers ask questions. Now, the most important way that we gain knowledge, or that we learn information, is by asking questions. Because if you start off just assuming that you have all the answers, well, you're not really going to learn anything. So the best way to learn is by asking questions. But also, when you're engaged in these kinds of conversations with pro-choice people, and you feel like they might not be making a very well-reasoned argument, questions can also help you kind of get at the heart of what the pro-choice person is arguing. So Greg Koukl, who's a Christian apologist, who actually is not exactly local to me, but he lives a lot closer than Devin does to me. He's in LA, and his organization is called Stand to Reason. He wrote a book called Tactics. And in his book, he talks about 3 what he calls Columbo questions. Now, Columbo was even a little bit before my time. For me, it's Adrian Monk. I don't know if you all recognize that name, but yeah. So Columbo was kind of this unassuming, this unassuming detective who kind of seemed a little bumbling, and like the criminals that he was investigating never really took him seriously just because of how he acted. But he always came up with this question that would kind of get at the heart of what the criminal was hiding. And so now, obviously, I'm not saying we're supposed to treat pro-choice people or our interlocutors as criminals under investigation. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying, though, is that we can use these same types of questions to sort of investigate what it is a pro-choice person is asking, especially if it's something we haven't heard before, because now we can kind of enter information gathering mode, and we can have the pro-choice person tell us for him or herself what it is he or she is trying to ask. We don't necessarily just want to assume it, because otherwise we might end up looking foolish. So the 3 Columbo questions that we want to ask are, the first one is, what do you mean by that? So like if someone was to say, for example, I believe abortion should be legal because I just think, it's her body. She can do whatever she wants with it. Well, there are at least 3 or 4 different things they might actually mean by that. So asking, what do you mean by that, will give you a chance to hear what kind of argument they're actually making in their own words. The second question we can ask is, how did you come to that conclusion? So now we're kind of putting them in the hot seat a little bit, because we're not just going to allow them to assume whatever they say is true. We want to actually have them justify it. And so whether or not they can justify it, by asking them, how did you come to that conclusion, now we're able to ask the person to give us either a supporting argument or evidence for their view, so we can hear where they're coming from. They might not be able to support it because it might just be a slogan they heard somewhere, or they might actually have reasons, or have some compelling reasons for believing what they do. You'll never know until you actually ask. And the third question then is, have you considered the implications of your view? And this is important because now we can actually use sort of what they call a reductio ad absurdum to show that the view that the pro-choice person is holding on to, if they really investigate the ramifications of what they believe, might not be a position that they want to hold. So, as another example, a pro-choice person who is arguing, well, I think that abortion is permissible because I just don't think the unborn are persons. So if he says, I don't think the unborn are persons, well, you can ask your first Columbo question. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I just think they're not self-aware. You can't be a person unless you're self-aware. And then your second question, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, I was reading this guy, you may have heard of him. His name is Peter Singer, and he says that, you're not a person until you're self-aware, because you have to be able to desire something in order to be harmed by being deprived of it. And so that's a supporting argument they might have for their view. So the third question then, have you considered the implication of your views, might run something a little like this. Okay, that seems to make sense on the surface, but have you considered that if you're holding self-awareness as the view that establishes personhood, well then, considering that we don't become self-aware until sometime after we're 1 year old, that you would also have to justify infanticide as well. And then that's kind of helping to get the gears turning in their head, because they might not have considered that before. Or they might have, because occasionally you might encounter like a first-year philosophy student who believes that philosophers are supposed to push the envelope a bit. But for most people, I think that'd be a bridge too far. Realizing that their view would have to justify infanticide as well, because I think most people probably would not go that far. So philosophers ask questions not only because it helps us learn, but because it gets at the heart of what other people believe. And if you've never heard their argument before, then it can help you get into fact-finding mode. So that instead of trying to assume what they believe and risking ending up looking foolish, you can actually take that time to learn what they believe and then formulate a response later as you're talking. So the third point then, after we talked about that philosophers think carefully about issues and philosophers ask questions, is that philosophers attack ideas, not people. Now, as Christians, we believe that all human beings are made in the image of God. And so because all human beings are made in the image of God, that means that we respect the unborn organisms, and the unborn human beings, and we want to protect them from abortion. But it also means that we respect the person that we're talking to, the pro-choice person, making what we might consider to be a really absurd or really ridiculous argument. We treat the person with respect. We don't treat the ideas with respect. And when I think about this particular point, I think about the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who was friends with another justice, Sonia Sotomayor, and they believed very different things. Scalia was conservative, and Sotomayor was liberal. And one day when Scalia was asked how he can be friends with the liberal judges, well, his response was something along the lines of, very good people can believe some very bad things. So we never want to denigrate the person, even if they're holding to a bad idea, because the bad idea needs to be attacked, not the person. In fact, the reason that we want to help other people find truth, if we found the truth, is not because we want to get brownie points. It's not because we want to win the argument. It's because we care about the person enough that we want to liberate them from their bad ideas. And if our ideas are the good ideas, the ones that can withstand scrutiny, we want them to accept our ideas as true. Okay, so philosophers think carefully about issues by making distinctions. Philosophers ask questions, and philosophers attack ideas, not people. Like I said, if we keep these three things in mind, then we'll be able to have a lot better conversations with pro-choice people. A lot of times, especially if you're talking on college campuses, like I do occasionally, the conversations can have a tendency to go one of three ways. Either they can be very ugly conversations with people name calling and yelling. That's something I've seen a couple of times. Thankfully, that's very rare that actually happens. It can go bad, where you have both people who are kind of talking past each other and no progress is being done on either person's front. Or the conversation can be a good one, in which both people are speaking respectfully, treating each other with respect, and seriously considering their views and responding to what each one says. So if you keep these things in mind, I think that your conversations, not just on the abortion issue, but even when just sharing your faith or talking about other kinds of issues, will go really good as well. So that's all I've got. So so we can go ahead and open it up for some Q&A then.
Any questions, comments, cries of outrage?
Right. Yeah, even from the live stream as well. If you have questions, just ask him. We've got Devin monitoring. Feel free. Try to stump the speaker. Either way. I'm also open to constructive criticism too, because this is actually a new talk that I'm debuting, and I want to tighten it up, make it better if I can. So if you have even just constructive criticism on the talk itself, I'm happy to listen. Yeah.
So I guess going back to the 1,000 embryos scenario, so I guess the argument then is we can still be consistent in believing that the embryos are persons, even if we think it'd be better to save the child over the embryos. Is that what you would say? Or
Yeah, there's a number of different ways you can go with it. The way that I gave in the presentation is one way. What I usually say is, okay, let's just suppose that you're right, that I don't think embryos are just as valuable as a toddler. Well, how does it follow then that I believe we should kill the embryos? Because even if I think they're less valuable, it doesn't mean I think they're so invaluable. Well, I guess invaluable means valuable, doesn't it? It's kind of one of the quirks of English. Doesn't mean that I think they're so non-valuable or unvaluable, I guess, that I think we should be able to kill them. So that just doesn't follow at all. But then I would also say that there is a situation I can conceive of in which I would actually rescue the embryos over the toddler. Because I have no idea, all things being equal, what the fate of those embryos is. They might be scheduled for implantation, they might be scheduled for experimentation, or they might just be sitting around continuing in limbo for who knows how long. And even if they are implanted into 1,000 women, I have no idea if any of them are going to implant or if any of them are going to survive until birth. So the toddler, I know, has a 100% chance of survival if I save him, whereas the embryos don't. So that's why I would save the toddler over the embryos, because it's a matter of, I think, survivability. But I think your point about the suffering and those kinds of things might be other considerations too, that if we leave the toddler alone, the toddler's going to suffer greatly, whereas the embryos are not. So I think that might be a valid way to approach the scenario also. But the one way I can think of that I would rescue the embryos over the toddler is if I could ever be 100% sure that those embryos would all survive, that they would all implant, that they would all survive until birth, then I could justify saving the embryos because I'd be saving 1,000 people over one person. But there is absolutely no situation in which I could ever be that positive. And so since there's no situation in which I could ever be that positive, I believe I'm justified in saving the toddler.
Now we know what to do.
Right. Yeah. So now if you're ever in that situation, just think back to,
We thought of one scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were
Right.
actually talking about this scenario earlier amongst ourselves.
Oh, you were?
We saw it on Twitter.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And we modified the situation so that if there were 1,000 brain-dead pregnant women instead of one toddler.
Oh.
Because like if they were actually, like able to be, they're actually actively growing and like instead
You're
of
already implanted.
yeah,
you're
so we
already
knew
growing.
their potential future fates other than
Yeah.
just led
But
to
that just makes it a little
a very weird
ridiculous.
picture.
Because then
Right.
you're having to save
Yeah.
1,000.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And in fact, because I can conceive of a situation in which you might actually save the embryos. Suppose the doctor who fathered the embryos is in the burning building, and he can save his 1,000 children, or he can save a toddler who he doesn't know. Well, then I don't think anybody would get on his case about saving the embryos over the toddler, because now he's saving his own offspring. So you can really just modify the situation. It's kind of interesting to think about, but it doesn't justify what the pro-choice person thinks it does. And you can really modify it any way you want. You can talk about, okay, there are 10 comatose people and one 5-year-old girl. Who are you going to save? If you save the 5-year-old girl, then do you think that we should just go off and kill these coma patients who may come out of it at some point?
Yeah,
Well, yeah, obviously that wouldn't follow.
Regardless
So.
of how you modify it, it's not like they could say, oh, this situation is more realistic. Because in what situation are you saving 1,000 embryos in a case that you can save real quick over a toddler? I mean, it's all nonsense.
Well, it is, but you can't just dismiss the thought experiment as nonsense, though, because that'll make it look like you don't really have an answer. So you do want to at least engage the thought experiment. But yeah, there are a lot of different ways that you can modify it to show that what the pro-choice person wants to show isn't going to happen. But yeah.
I just thought it was very helpful that you broke it down saying one is all about saving life and the other is about killing.
Yeah.
They're just two different things.
Yeah. So it's really,
Sorry,
Yeah. No worries.
Well, just going back to the scenario you're talking about saving the
Yeah.
1,000 over the one, does that mean that 1,000 human lives are more important than one human life? Because I thought we're all like priceless and made in God's image, so is I don't know, is
I think
1,000 more
It is
important than
that's the
one?
point, is that the rationale is there's 1,000, but the chances of, even if there was a chance, like know that 1,000 would for sure become all 1,000 people, the rationale behind that doesn't follow.
We still can't
Right.
measure that 1,000 intrinsic lives are more valuable than one intrinsic life.
Right.
We can't make that.
Yeah, because even if you do save the 1,000 embryos and not the toddler, then that doesn't follow that you think the toddler is less valuable than the embryos, because you're just comparing the number of lives with each other. So it's just not a good thought experiment. It's interesting to think about, but it doesn't show who the pro-life person values or doesn't value.
It's
Well, I
putting
think
a
it's-
value
so.
on one versus the other.
Right.
I think it's really compassionate to, or someone mentioned amount of pain and suffering. Embryos wouldn't feel any pain and suffering. Yeah, they would be, deleted from the universe. Obviously, they would be in heaven or hell. Well, I guess I don't know how that works.
Yeah, that's a different theological discussion altogether.
But anyway,
My personal conviction is I think children who die early go to heaven, but I don't think there's any necessarily strong biblical support for that. So it's not a hill I die on.
right.
So,
So in order to prevent suffering, I think that's the best reason in my mind.
Yeah.
Which is the best why to save the toddler versus the embryos.
Yeah.
Because the toddler wouldn't feel pain and suffering.
Right, and so another aspect of it is, because I think that's a good way to go. You can definitely think, okay, well, the toddler is going to be suffering, the embryos are not. I think the more compassionate thing is to save the toddler. But it might be that when you're in that situation, you don't have 10 minutes to sit down and deliberate about who you're going to rescue. So it might be that your emotions kind of kick in. The toddler looks more like you than these embryos, so you save the toddler. That might be the situation too. The problem is that that's a snap decision that you made without deliberating or without reasoning reasoning for it. And so you might have made the wrong decision, after like thinking about it later. You might have thought, man, why did I do that? I should have gone for the embryos. Or you might have made the right decision. But even if you made the wrong decision, that doesn't show that you don't care about these other embryos. It just shows that there was some relevant factor that you considered important in the moment that you acted. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the fact that there is a dilemma at all shows that we know both are valuable.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's trying to catch you on this horn of, you really don't think embryos are, but it's the fact that there's a dilemma at all.
Right.
Kind of shows that that's not the case.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point too. So
Remember our fun SES ethics class days? Going over I remember Richard House going over this experiment
Oh yeah.
with us.
Wow.
I remember introducing the trolley car experiment to my worldview
Oh
students.
my word.
That was a mistake.
Fun fact. I don't know if you mentioned this in the class, but the trolley experiment was actually constructed by a pro-life philosopher in the context of investigating double effect reasoning when it comes to abortion. Yeah.
Well, sometimes the thought experiments loom larger than the actual principle you're trying to tease out of it.
Right.
It got to be too much for these 8th and 9th graders to handle. And not just them, some college students too.
Yeah.
And maybe a wife.
Yeah, and partly too, I think, and this was to Hannah's point, I think that a lot of times these thought experiments try to funnel us into a utilitarian ethic. That they're assuming from the outset that you're going to work in some type of utilitarian framework.
Yeah.
But if you value human life, if we turn the experiment on its head and and look at it from backwards, instead of saying is one more valuable than 1,000, or something like that, well, are we saying then in the utilitarian view that the good of the many outweighs the good of the few?
That's also a Vulcan ethic too.
Yeah, it's also Vulcan. So under that logic, we should be kidnapping college students to harvest their organs to save lives.
Right.
It leads to a lot of absurdities like that.
Yeah, and actually, Judith Jarvis Thompson, who is one of the most famous pro-choice philosophers, she's also the one who's interacted the most with the trolley thought experiment, and she actually wrote a persuasive essay against utilitarian ethics. So I thought it was kind of cool. Just studying the abortion issue, you start to realize that they have like ties with all of these different things. So I think it's kind of interesting to read what else they involve themselves in. I actually find things like this, really interesting, and I think ethical issues especially are fascinating, and metaphysical things. And a lot of people think that metaphysics is kind of useless because it's just like esoteric thinking. But the reality of it is, wherever you fall down on metaphysics is going to affect the rest of your life and the rest of the way that you view things. And so, having a good metaphysical grounding is, I think, important as well for good moral reasoning and those kinds of things.
Even having no metaphysic is a metaphysic.
Right.
I mean, that sounds counterintuitive, but to say that there are no metaphysics, there's nothing beyond physics, that is a metaphysical position, and it will affect exactly in the ways that you've said.
Right. Yeah.
Saying you don't have a worldview.
Not having a worldview is your worldview. And so if you're like a strict materialist, then that's going to cause you, for example, to think that no human beings are valuable. And so why not just kill them all? You might become like someone like David Benatar, who considers himself pro-death. I would never call a pro-choice person pro-death because that's rude, and they don't like to be called pro-death. We should call them what they want to be called. But there are actually people like David Benatar who call themselves pro-death and believe that we have a moral obligation not to reproduce. So, well, exactly, yeah. That's a great thing to ask him. But yeah, he would say something along the lines of that life is just so bad that all of the bad stuff in life overpowers the good. That reproducing is actually a harm to every human being. And so for that kind of person, you kind of think, well, he probably had some, maybe he was abused when he was a kid or something, and that's why he came to this kind of conclusion. I don't know much about his background, but that's kind of what I would think. And so, that's just speculation. I don't know for sure, but it seems like that was kind of the... Yeah, because he would say there's a distinction between bringing someone into existence and killing them once they're already here. So he believes abortion is permitted up until latent pregnancy, and then once they become a person, then it's no longer permissible to kill them. You should kill them before they become a person in the womb. So you should, yeah, you have an obligation to, because reproducing is a harm to every human being. So, yeah. And yeah, like I said, I could be here for hours if I was going to exhaustively cover the entire range of pro-choice arguments. But yeah.
I just want to know your perspective on this. There's a lot of exceptions that people always want to bring up, like cases of rape and.
Yeah.
What would you say to the life of the mother is in danger? What would you say?
Yeah. Okay, so the question was, what would I say if the mother's life is in danger, as far as abortion is concerned? So yeah, I look at it a couple of different ways. First of all, there's the situation of triage. If two people are in mortal jeopardy, then it's permissible to save one and not the other, because otherwise you might lose them both if you don't. The embryo is definitely going to die, and the mother will not die if you remove the embryo. So I think that it's permissible to save the mother's life even at the expense of the embryos. But now this requires some qualification, because I think that there are right ways to go about it and there are wrong ways to go about it. And for this, I rely on what's called double effect reasoning. I'm not a Catholic, but I'm actually persuaded by a lot of Catholic philosophy, and this is something that Catholic philosophers have talked about. So double effect reasoning says that there must be four criteria that are satisfied in order for an act to be justified. One of those qualifications is that the good that comes about must be comparable to the bad, or the bad that is done must be comparable to the good, or vice versa, something like that. But basically, saving the mother's life and losing the embryo's life are comparable, because you're losing one life, but you're saving another. Another criterion is that the bad act that is performed must be foreseen but not intended. And then another qualification is that the bad act must not directly influence the good effect. So the bad thing you do cannot be a direct cause of the bad thing that happens. So basically, let's consider a case of ectopic pregnancy. In an ectopic pregnancy, the embryo implants somewhere other than the womb, usually in the fallopian tube. So if it implants in the fallopian tube and we don't do anything about it, the embryo is going to continue to grow and develop, and it's going to rupture the tube, and the mother is going to hemorrhage and most likely die. Now, there's a right way to resolve the situation and a wrong way, because the intention is there. The intention is not to kill the embryo. The intention is to save the mother's life, but in saving the mother's life, the death of the embryo is foreseen but not intended. Also, the death of the embryo must not be directly caused by the doctors trying to save the mother's life. So there are actually three ways you can resolve an ectopic pregnancy. One is by giving her a drug called methotrexate, which she takes, and then that would cause the embryo to disengage from the fallopian tube, and then the embryo would disintegrate in the woman's body. I would not think that would be morally permissible, because that would be an act of directly killing the embryo in order to save the life of the mother. But what I would think is permissible would be to remove the offending part of the mother's fallopian tube that has the embryo in it. If you remove the tube, you're saving the mother's life, but you're not directly killing the embryo. Removing the tube, you foresee that the embryo is going to die, but it's not intended, and the embryo is not killed by a direct action by you. What kills the embryo is that its lack of ability to survive outside the environment of the mother's body. So I would think, due to double effect reasoning and the situation of triage, I would think that a life-saving medical procedure to save the mother's life would be permissible, but a direct abortion to directly kill the unborn child would not. So there's a right way and a wrong way which can resolve the situations, I would say.
Okay, so if I think another one that's very common is if the mom gets cancer and chemo is required, and
right.
Would you say that it would be better for them to leave the child and let her have a natural abortion through chemo, or would it be better to take the embryo out before all the chemo, because that can be really hard on the embryo? I mean, depending on the level. I mean, if it's really small, then I think it wouldn't be as bad. But if it's almost fully formed, then
okay. So the question, yeah. So the question is, what about a woman with cancer who undergoes chemotherapy? And this is a little bit trickier because from what I understand, I'm not a doctor, so I might have read faulty information on this, but from what I've read, I don't think a fetus is necessarily at risk when a woman undergoes chemotherapy. I think that fetuses can often survive chemotherapy, but when it comes to actually doing chemotherapy, and again, like I said, I could have read bad information on that because I'm not a doctor myself. There is actually a doctor who works for LTI named Rich Papard, who I usually go to with my medical questions, but unfortunately, I don't have him here with me right now. So if there's minimal risk to the fetus, I would say that it would be permissible. If there was greater risk to the fetus, I'm not entirely sure where I would land on this. I might have, in fact, I should probably talk to him in case this question comes up again. But because it seems to me that, because I think under double effect reasoning, I think the chemotherapy would be a direct act of harm to the fetus. So I'm not sure that would necessarily be permissible under double effect. But
do not go under, not have chemotherapy at all, but let the cancer progress.
Okay. So that's kind of my instinct on that. And again, I could be mistaken. If I'll talk to Rich and he might set me straight on this. But I have talked to him before, and there are things that a woman will go through that the doctor can't do because they want to preserve the life of the fetus. So, for example, if a woman needs to have, for example, like a tooth pulled or something, a doctor will not give her anesthetic because that could cause harm to the fetus. And so, in that case, then the doctor would not act for in the interest of the woman's comfort because it might cause harm to the fetus. But considering that this is a life or death situation, and if she can't wait until she gives birth, my instinct tells me that if there's a minimal chance to the fetus, then I would think it would be permissible to do so. If there was a great chance that the fetus would be killed because of it, then I'm not quite so sure. So.
Any other questions? TJ, for active potency, and you said that extends to fertilization, would also be important to not just fertilization but also to conception, because that's still active potency that at the point it can become a child and then fully form into become like a full human fetus. So will that also extend for the purpose of active potency, that it has the potential of becoming a human, because if you do nothing, it could become a child instead of just a sperm or just an egg that could still come together?
Okay, could you repeat your question?
Sorry,
I'm not sure I understood.
That active potency doesn't extend to just fertilization, but that also extends to conception, that it still has the active potential of becoming a child and not just a sperm and an egg by itself.
So are you talking about the sperm and the egg having the potency?
Yes. So once conception happens, that it has the active potency to become a child. Does active potency extend to conception, not just fertilization?
Okay, so I would say that it doesn't necessarily extend to fertilization, because once the human being comes into existence, that single cell zygote that results from the fertilization has the active potency to develop into a more mature human being. Prior to that, you have two individual entities, the sperm cell and the ovum cell, and those, I would say, they don't have active potency, because if you leave them alone, they're just going to die. Nothing's going to happen if they're just left alone. Like they say, it takes two to tango. It takes two to conceive a child. So if they don't interact, then they're just going to die. So they don't have the active potency to become a human being. I would say that they do have the passive potency to become a human being, because in order for them to become a human, they have to fuse together. And so that act of fusion is what sets off the chain reaction to become a human being.
Even though it's already on the journey to become a human being.
Yeah, because the sperm and the ovum are not identical to the human that they create. It's a completely different entity. So since it's a different entity, then so let's think of it this way. Let's consider a cow. Now a cow, let's say a calf, a baby cow has the potential to become a full-blown adult heifer. That calf, sorry to any vegans in the room, but that calf also has the potential to become a hamburger at McDonald's. Now, it has those potencies in a different way. It has the active potency to become a heifer, because it just needs to grow and develop, and all of these things take place within the calf itself. It has the passive potency to become a hamburger, because someone has to kill it, and then grind it up and mold it into a hamburger that they serve at McDonald's. And so it has the passive potency because it won't become a hamburger on its own. So the sperm and the ovum cells are more like the cow transitioning to a hamburger. That the sperm and the ovum cell, they are different entities than the human being that results from them. And so they have the passive potency to become a human because they have to be acted on by the outside, and that act of change is not an identity preserving change. They become something other than what they are when they go in to become the new human individual. This is different from the single-celled zygote that results, because once that zygote results, then it has the active potency to develop itself. And all of those changes are within its internal programming, and so all of those changes preserve the thing's identity throughout its entire life. Is that a little bit clearer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So what if we slightly modify this, maybe a scenario like you have the match, right, which is active, and then you drop it, and it goes into like an oil pit or something like that. But before it hits the oil pit, you bat it out of the way. You bat the thing out of the way. Would that be denying this active potential, or would that be more still a passive potential? I think kind of that's what TJ's getting at, because it falls into the Catholic position that contraceptives are not good.
Right. Yeah, and that's something that I agree with the Catholic philosophers on also, is that using contraceptive is immoral. But it's for a slightly different reason. So basically, okay, so if we're considering a match that we light on fire, that match has that active potency to become on fire. Now, the potency itself is within the oil. So if you drop a match, that act of dropping the match has nothing to do with potential. It's not active potential or passive potential when you're dropping the match. You're just basically trying to take a lighted match and light the oil on fire. If the match strikes the oil then interacts with the fire from the match and it lights on fire. And that's because the oil has the passive potential to light on fire, but it has to be lit on fire by something that had it within itself to produce fire, like the match, because the oil doesn't have that within itself. It has to be acted on by the outside. So the chemical reaction of the oil interacting with the fire is what actualizes the potency that it has. So it's not the act of dropping the match that has a potency. It's just the oil has that potency, and if it interacts with the match, then that potency becomes actualized. So if you bat that match out of the way at the last second and the oil doesn't light on fire, then nothing happens. You've just basically prevented the oil from lighting on fire is all that happened. So you've prevented the oil from actualizing its potency to be on fire. Essentially is what happened. Is that clearer? Or okay. I mean, maybe there's a way you can, or because I'm describing it as as simplistically as I can. I'm not sure if like I said, I don't teach this concept very often, so there might be on my end something I'm not explaining very well, but
clear on just based on the questions, and maybe I've been conflating. I didn't see. What's the distinction between conception and fertilization? I'd conflated those in my mind, thinking they were the same thing. Is there a distinction there?
Actually, a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, and I don't know if it's necessarily important that we keep these two distinctions separate. The way that I usually think about them is fertilization is the process. The sperm interacts with the ovum, and there's like a 24 to 48 hour process. It's like a 5 or 6 step process that occurs, and that whole process is what I consider to be fertilization. Conception I usually use as once that process finishes and the new human being is there in existence. So that's the distinction that I make. I don't think those are necessarily distinctions that are made by the doctors themselves. They might use them interchangeably. I'm not sure, but I know that a lot of pro-life people tend to use them interchangeably, and it's not necessarily a hill I want to die on to say we absolutely should keep these things separate. Because usually, a pro-choice person will know what you mean by fertilization or conception, and if they don't, then you can always just clarify later. So
you're saying after the 24 to 48 hours. Then the new zygote is formed, or when conception happens, it is being formed. Because then there's an argument there from Prophet.
Yeah. So okay. So yeah. So
the morning after pill. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So here's the thing. No, there is scientific consensus that fertilization is the process that creates a new human being. From what I've read, there's no scientific consensus about when exactly during that fertilization process it happens. There are arguments for different times within that fertilization process. But there's no question that once fertilization has completed, a new human being is in existence. So the morning after pill, if it does make the womb inhospitable for a human zygote, then it is an early abortion because you're killing a human being that's already been conceived. So again, that's one reason why I'm not sure it's necessarily an important distinction, because we don't have any way of killing a human being that early, like during the fertilization process. So since there's no way really to kill it, then it's not really necessary that we pinpoint exactly when the new human being comes into existence in order for our argument to get off the ground, because there's just no question that once conception is completed, then a human being exists. So yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's the connection of when sperm meets ovum that it has the active potency to become everything that it's supposed to be.
Well, yeah, once the human being comes into existence, because fertilization is like a 5 or 6 step process, and so it's like the sperm ceases to exist and contributes its genetic material to the ovum. The genetic material mixes, and the ovum undergoes a radical change to become the zygote. Things like that. All of these things kind of happen, and so sometime during that process, the new human emerges. So there's no question that once the fertilization process is ended, that a human being exists. Yeah.
I think I would disagree that it's at the end, because I think the point of the active potency was that as soon as it has the full potential to become something else, like a human, and that would be as soon as it joins, because the sperm and the egg are complete; those are not going to do anything by themselves, and as soon as they join together, it's progressing. But I wanted to just make a comment. I think what TJ and Kevin were trying to say with the match and everything, is it wrong to stop a passive potency from becoming active potency? Because the sperm are passive, but when they join, they're active.
Right.
So is it wrong to prevent the passive from becoming active?
Oh, okay. Are you speaking like in general, or just as has to do with contraceptives?
I mean, mostly just the contraceptive. Is blocking the sperm wrong?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if we're just talking about causing about preventing the entities with the passive potential to become the human being, if we're just talking about that act, I would say that no, there's nothing wrong with preventing those two entities from coming into contact with each other in order to produce the new human being that then has the active potency to continue on. I would, however, say, so I'm just saying, considering that, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, because you're not killing a human being that's already in existence. You're preventing one from coming into existence. And so I think that's important to keep separate as well. But I do think that using contraceptives are immoral for the same reason that Catholic philosophers would say, because I'm also a proponent of natural law. And I think that if you're going to, that every time you have sex, that you need to do so in a way that's procreative. And if you act in such a way that's going to thwart the natural end, or the way toward which the reproductive organs are directed, if you're going to actively work to thwart that, I think that's wrong, because and again, that's a whole another topic too, for a whole other time. But yeah, so suffice it to say, I would say that contraceptives are immoral, because I'm convinced that natural law is a correct ethical approach. So yeah. Did that answer your question a little bit better now that we got that cleared away? Or okay, yeah, okay, yes, okay. So yeah, so I guess I was misunderstanding what you were asking. So yeah, okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Oh, Devin has you on camera duty?
I guess so. I'm not sure what to do when we're all done, though.
Oh yeah, I don't know either.
I think I can just hit the off button.
I'm just the performing monkey. So yeah.
There weren't any questions on.
Oh, yeah, good question.
I can see.
Okay, because we did get one yesterday, a question from the Facebook Live group, but yeah.
And it would show up here at the bottom, I imagine.
I believe so. Yeah, wherever the chat text box is at.
There's a few comments. That's great. Yeah.
Victoria has a question.
I do have a question.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I was confused how the first thing that you said and the second thing that you said followed, it seemed to contradict. But maybe I heard it wrong or misunderstood. You're talking about with natural law and preventing passive to becoming active. You said that could you repeat what you were saying?
That's okay. I'm actually not used to people paying such close attention and asking me questions about it. So that's great. It helps keep me honest too. So you're talking about the contraceptive thing?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was saying that just alone, like if you're not talking about natural law, then I don't think there'd be anything wrong with necessarily preventing the sperm and the ovum from coming into contact, because you're not killing a human being that's already come into existence. You're preventing a human being from coming into existence. So just taking that in isolation, I would say that I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. So then you,
I'm following with that, but
okay.
then you connected it to natural law.
Yeah, so I would no. So I'm not disagreeing with that specifically. All I'm saying is I do believe that using contraception is immoral because I'm persuaded by natural law. But it's not because of what I just said. It's for a different reason, because you're thwarting the natural end of the reproductive organs, or in other words, you're actively preventing the purpose of the reproductive organs from fulfilling their purpose.
That's
essentially.
Not what
So you would
sexuality
not.
is for. That's not what sexuality is for. Is what you're doing. Yeah.
So you would not agree that, but then I'm sorry, I'm still confused. So you would not agree that preventing something passive becoming active is correct, because right?
No. I'm saying I'm considering something else.
Then wouldn't it?
Yes, because I'm saying I would disagree with using contraceptives for a completely different reason. I'm saying if we just take that in isolation, that you're preventing the sperm and the ovum from coming into contact, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, taking it in isolation. So I don't think that's why using contraceptives is immoral. I believe, because I come at it from a natural law perspective, not from a preventing the human being from coming into existence perspective. So I just come at it from a different angle is why.
Okay, gotcha.
So yeah, okay, no worries. No, it's fine.
Difference is like potential versus purpose. Like,
right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's not. It has nothing to do with the potential of anything to become anything else. It just has to do with what the natural use of our particular body parts are for, and so.
So could I ask a question going way back to the distinctions?
Yeah.
Changing topic. Could you just restate again the qualitative changes versus the quantitative changes?
Yeah, so a qualitative change is a change that something undergoes that just changes the kinds of things that it can do. So quality just has to do with properties. Like if we consider the human embryo at fertilization, well, it's a single-celled zygote. As the embryo continues to develop, the cells start splitting into 2 and then 4 and then 8, and eventually it becomes it starts taking on more what we consider to be human features, and then it has a heartbeat in the 3rd week. Its brain starts functioning around the 6th week, and it has all of these changes that it's undergoing. It's getting bigger. It's becoming more developed. It's becoming less and less dependent on her body as the pregnancy goes on. All of these are qualitative changes. They're qualitative changes because they're just changes in the certain properties that the unborn organism has, and none of these changes actually change the nature of the organism that's undergoing them. So just because the single-celled zygote now has a beating heart and a functioning brain and working kidneys and all of these things, that doesn't change the nature or the humanness of the embryo at the single cell stage, because all of these changes were within its internal programming to undergo. And so compare that with a quantitative change. A quantitative change is a change that something can undergo that changes its nature entirely. And so that might be something like killing a cow and turning it into a hamburger. Making a cow a hamburger is a quantitative change because the cow ceases to exist, even though certain parts of its anatomy remain behind, and become tasty food. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, you're welcome.
But we have a question online from Miss Teresa Horner.
Okay.
And I'll have you repeat it.
Okay, she gets a gold star for attending multiple meetings.
She says, I find that some pro-choice people are also the ones who want us to donate so that no homeless cat or dog is euthanized. How do they come to such a conclusion?
I mean, what's that? Oh, repeat the question. Okay, so the question has to do with that a lot of pro-choice people give money to shelters with dogs and cats to make sure they don't get euthanized. Yeah, so how do pro-choice people come to that conclusion? And I mean, the only thing I can really just say is you'll have to ask them, because a lot of people hold various views, and some of them are contradictory, some are not. But in this case, you might be dealing with a pro-choice person who loves animals, and so they might think that. They might be like a Peter Singer kind of person that they think, Peter Singer wouldn't think this is about cats or dogs, but they might be kind of along the same lines that they think, an adult cat is of more value than, say, an embryonic human. So they would think that we should, instead of donating money, say, to pregnancy care centers, they might think we should give them to no-kill animal shelters or something to make sure that dogs or cats aren't killed. So it just might be that even though they don't believe that human beings in the womb are valuable, they do believe that other kinds of animals are valuable and we should protect them. So I don't think that's necessarily contradictory. I just think that they're not going far enough when they try to consider which human beings deserve our respect as well.
Or I think a lot of times they don't think it's a human being in the womb, right? Because I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the issue with the pro-choice and the pro-life issue, I think the issue is, when does life begin? Not, is it okay to kill a human, right? I think
well, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah, I mean, you have like your Peter Singers, but I don't think they're the majority of like the.
Well, and again, it's a little bit more complicated than that too, because it's true that several pro-choice people I've encountered are not very knowledgeable on the science of embryology, even though they should be, because it's like fifth grade, biology stuff that they should know. But a lot of them just don't know. But then you do get a lot of people who do think that it is a human being, but that it's okay to kill. The people who come from bodily rights think that, okay, it is a human being, or it might be a human being, but whether it is or not is irrelevant, because I can kill it whether or not it is, because of Thompson's violinist thought experiment or something. So you do encounter some pro-choice people who do question the biology, even though there's scientific consensus, and then you get pro-choice people who don't question the biology but think you can kill it anyway because of bodily rights, and then you get people who do come at it from a personhood angle. It's not conscious, it's not out in the world yet. It's just not a valuable human being. So it really just depends on the kind of person you encounter.
Any questions?
Can you recap super quick what the difference between intrinsic and instrumental value was?
Yeah, basically intrinsic value is where the value comes from within the thing, and instrumental value is a kind of extrinsic value where the value comes from outside of it. So human beings, we would say, is intrinsically valuable. We would also say that beauty is intrinsically valuable. We would say art is intrinsically valuable. All of these are intrinsically valuable because the value is not added from the outside, but these things are worth seeking for their own sake.